Welcome the anointed ones. When someone studies you harder than they study themselves, they've already lost. There are people who dislike you quietly, and then there are people who make you their full-time project. This story isn't about random opposition or casual envy. This is about obsession, the kind that watches, tracks, imitates, tests, escalates, and still can't figure out why you won't break. Somewhere along the line, this stopped being a personal grudge and turned into a campaign. Here's a fact most people don't like to admit. Obsession always creates the opposite of its intended result. Psychologists have long observed that fixated opponents lose objectivity over time. Their thinking narrows, their emotions override strategy. They start reacting instead of planning, and when that happens, the person being watched quietly gains the advantage, whether they realize it or not. That's exactly what happened here. What you were dealing with wasn't just resistance. It was a calculated effort to study your reactions, your limits, your patterns. Every setback was meant to map you. Every provocation was meant to extract data. But instead of becoming predictable, you did something inconvenient. You evolved. And while you were adapting, whoever was trying to take you down kept using the same tired playbook, just louder and more desperate. The irony? The more attention they gave you, the clearer you became. You started noticing timing, repetition, motives that didn't add up. And once you see the pattern, the illusion collapses. What looked intimidating starts looking sloppy, almost embarrassing, like someone rereading your old messages while claiming they're totally unbothered. That's where the humor sneaks in. Because at some point, you realize you're not in danger. You're being audited by someone who keeps failing their own exam. This isn't a story about superstition or theatrics. It's about power dynamics, awareness, and what happens when someone underestimates a person who doesn't react on schedule. When you stop dancing to the tune, the music gets real awkward for the one playing it. So if you've ever felt like resistance followed you unusually closely, like obstacles were oddly personalized, or like certain people were far too invested in your downfall, stay right here. What you're about to hear isn't dramatic, it's diagnostic. And once you understand what was really happening behind the scenes, a lot of things are going to click into place. Number 1. The obsession wasn't about destroying you. It was about owning your frequency. What most people misunderstand is that true obsession doesn't aim for elimination first. It aims for access. Whoever fixated on you wasn't trying to erase you from the board. They were trying to figure out how you work, why you move the way you do, and what gives you that unsettling edge they couldn't copy. Destruction would have been easy if that were the real goal. Control is harder, and that's what they wanted. They studied you because your presence disrupted their sense of authority. You didn't follow the emotional rules they depended on. You didn't react when expected, crumble when pressured, or chase validation when baited. That kind of self-contained energy bothers people who rely on influence, manipulation, or fear to feel powerful. So instead of stepping back, they leaned in. Too close. Every attempt to destabilize you was really an attempt to get inside your rhythm. They wanted to provoke a reaction they could use, a weakness they could exploit, a habit they could predict. But what they found was consistency where chaos should have been. You stayed yourself under stress. You didn't fracture into versions they could manage. That's when fascination turned into fixation. Here's the uncomfortable truth. People only try to own what they secretly admire or feel threatened by. They don't obsess over things they believe are beneath them. Your clarity exposed their confusion. Your steadiness highlighted their dependence on tricks. And instead of correcting themselves, they tried to study you like a puzzle that owed them answers. But your frequency isn't something that can be borrowed. It's built from alignment, not performance. You don't hold it because you learned a technique. You hold it because you refuse to live out of sync with yourself. That's why every attempt to copy you fell flat. They could mimic behaviors, repeat words, even mirror timing, but none of it carried weight. The obsession collapsed the moment they realized this wasn't something they could extract. You weren't a source to be drained. You were a system that renews itself. And once that truth set in, fear replaced confidence. Because when someone can't own your frequency, the only option left is to retreat and pretend they were never watching you so closely in the first place. Number 2, every demon sent was a diagnostic tool, and you passed every test. What looked like non-stop pressure wasn't random bad luck. It was targeted stress, applied in layers, meant to measure how you respond when pushed. Each challenge was designed to trigger something specific: fear, anger, desperation, self-doubt. Not because they wanted chaos, but because reactions give information. Information gives leverage, and leverage is the real currency in any hidden battle. The first wave was light, small disruptions, minor betrayals, subtle confusion. That stage was about observation. They were watching to see what rattles you, how fast you recover, and whether you internalize blame. You didn't. You adjusted, quietly. That alone threw off the entire plan. So they escalated. Losses got heavier. Opposition got louder. People started acting strangely around you. The goal was to overload your system and force you into a predictable survival mode. Most people either freeze, explode, or fold inward at that point. You didn't choose any of those. You stayed functional. You kept thinking. That made you dangerous in a way they hadn't planned for. Each attempt to break you ended up revealing how adaptable you really are. You learned faster under pressure. You spotted patterns sooner. You stopped expecting fairness and started reading motives. That shift alone meant the tests stopped working. You weren't just enduring the pressure, you were extracting insight from it. Here's what really scared them. You didn't come out bitter. You didn't lose your sense of self. The tests failed to corrupt you. Instead of shrinking, your judgment sharpened. Instead of hardening, you got clearer. That outcome wasn't on their chart. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Every challenge they sent had trained you. You'd already built tolerance where they expected trauma, awareness where they expected confusion, and calm where they expected collapse. They were still collecting data while you were rewriting your internal rules. In the end, the biggest mistake wasn't underestimating your strength. It was assuming you were fragile in the first place. They kept running tests on someone who had already outgrown the need to prove anything. And when every test comes back clean, the only conclusion left is that the system testing you is the one that's flawed. Number 3, you didn't fight demons. You outgrew their operating system. At a certain point, the struggle stopped feeling like a battle and started feeling outdated. Not because the pressure disappeared, but because the tactics stopped making sense to you. The same triggers, the same mind games, the same emotional traps kept showing up, and instead of reacting, you noticed how predictable they were. That's when growth quietly took over. Those systems rely on people staying stuck in old patterns. Fear, guilt, urgency, approval-seeking, those are the buttons they press. But you didn't keep those buttons wired the same way. You changed how you process stress. You questioned narratives instead of swallowing them. You slowed down when they expected panic. And the moment you did that, their influence weakened. Outgrowing a system doesn't look dramatic. There's no loud victory. It looks like boredom where there used to be anxiety. It looks like clarity where there used to be confusion. You stopped arguing with manipulation because you no longer spoke its language. And when something can't communicate with you, it can't control you. They kept sending the same energy, hoping for the old version of you to respond. But that version wasn't available anymore. You had updated internally. You were operating from awareness instead of reaction. That's why things that once felt heavy suddenly felt obvious. Not easy, just obvious. What really shifted was your sense of time. Urgency stopped running you. You didn't rush to fix everything or explain yourself. You learned that speed benefits the one setting the trap. Slowness protects the one who sees it. That alone neutralized half the tactics being used against you. The truth is, you didn't overpower anything. You rendered it incompatible. Like old software trying to run on a system that no longer supports it, the attacks glitched, froze, and failed. Not because you fought harder, but because you stopped feeding the loop. That's the part few people talk about. Growth isn't just becoming stronger. It's becoming unreadable to outdated strategies. When you no longer react the way you're expected to, the game collapses, and the moment you realize you're not fighting anymore, you understand the war ended the day you stopped playing by rules that were never meant for you in the first place. Number 4. The warlock underestimated how clean your core really was. Most people assume that everyone carries hidden damage, secret fractures, or weaknesses they can exploit. That's exactly the assumption your opponent made. They expected to find some dark corner, some vulnerability buried under years of pressure, some part of you that could be manipulated. What they didn't realize is that your foundation wasn't just strong, it was fundamentally untouchable. They miscalculated because they couldn't measure purity with their tools. Every attempt to provoke you, every trap they set, was meant to expose a flaw. They expected that repeated pressure would reveal cracks. But they didn't account for the fact that your integrity isn't conditional. You don't operate on fear, greed, or ego. You operate from a place that refuses compromise with toxicity. And that kind of inner alignment isn't something that can be forced or borrowed. It either exists or it doesn't. The more they pushed, the more obvious their misjudgment became. Every failed attempt left them frustrated and visibly rattled. They didn't just fail to manipulate you, they failed to even understand you. That's the core of why obsession turns dangerous for the obsessed. When you target someone with no exploitable weaknesses, your tactics become louder, more desperate, and ultimately self-defeating. What they couldn't grasp is that clean doesn't mean naive, and integrity doesn't mean soft. Your purity didn't make you fragile, it made you untouchable. They thought they could bend you, test you, or corrupt you. Instead, every act they committed highlighted their own desperation. Each failed move reflected their incapacity to control something inherently incorruptible. By underestimating you, they set themselves up for repeated embarrassment. Their plan was to find leverage, but the very thing they sought, a flaw, simply didn't exist. And that revelation hit harder than any spell or manipulation ever could. Because the moment you realize someone has been trying to break you and failing spectacularly, you understand something fundamental. The only thing they can truly touch is themselves, while you continue moving forward completely unshaken. Being untouchable isn't about arrogance or denial. It's about knowing the truth of your core, and that truth is a force even the most obsessive warlock cannot overcome. Number 5. Your awareness dismantled spells before they activated. There's a level of perception that doesn't just notice energy, it intercepts it before it even lands. That's what you were operating from. Every attempt to manipulate, every ritual, every psychological attack or subtle interference was neutralized not by force but by sheer recognition. You didn't need to fight, you didn't need to defend. You simply saw it coming, understood its purpose, and it lost its power the moment it was conceived. This is what terrifies someone who relies on control. They assume fear, surprise, or confusion will work because everyone else reacts predictably. But when someone notices the mechanics behind the scheme, the effect collapses. You weren't just avoiding traps. You were rewriting the game by refusing to feed it with ignorance. Every spell, every projection, every attempt to destabilize you fell flat because it relied on unawareness. And you weren't unaware. Your awareness wasn't passive. It wasn't a quiet observation from the sidelines. It was active, precise, and instinctive. You could feel patterns before they formed, read motives before they were spoken, and detect intentions before they were even acted upon. That level of clarity is rare and deeply unsettling for anyone whose strategies are built on hidden influence. As a result, their arsenal of tactics became almost useless. They escalated, thinking volume could compensate for precision, thinking repetition could catch you off guard. But awareness operates on a different timeline than fear or reaction. You weren't just dodging attacks. You were dismantling them from the inside out. Each failed attempt forced them to reconsider, to scramble, to improvise, and each misstep revealed how dependent they were on control they couldn't attain. The irony is sharp. The more obsessed they became, the clearer your superiority grew. They believed power came from doing, from manipulating, from overwhelming. You demonstrated that true power lies in seeing, understanding, and neutralizing before it ever becomes a threat. Awareness isn't just defense, it's disarmament, and by the time they realized it, the war had already tilted irrevocably in your favor. Number 6, they mistook your restraint for weakness and paid for it repeatedly. What fooled them wasn't your lack of reaction, it was their misunderstanding of it. They assumed that because you didn't lash out, didn't expose everything, and didn't retaliate publicly, you were unable or afraid. In their world, power only looks like noise, so when you stayed calm, they mistook discipline for passivity. That misread became their biggest mistake. Your restraint wasn't about being nice or trying to keep peace. It was about control. You knew that reacting too fast hands the advantage to whoever set the trap. You understood that not every attack deserves a response, and not every provocation deserves energy. While they were swinging wildly, you were choosing timing, and timing always beats impulse. They kept escalating because they thought pressure would force your hand. Louder attacks, bolder moves, more public attempts to shake you. Each time you didn't respond the way they expected, they grew more confident in the wrong conclusion. They believed they were winning because you weren't reacting. In reality, you were gathering information, watching patterns repeat, and letting them reveal exactly who they were. Restraint requires strength most people don't have. It means holding back when ego wants to speak. It means letting lies hang long enough for the truth to expose itself. It means trusting that consistency outlasts chaos. They didn't understand that kind of power, so they kept pushing, and every push made their position weaker. When you finally moved, it wasn't emotional. It was surgical. You didn't over-explain. You didn't dramatize. You acted with precision, using the openings they'd created themselves through overreach. That's when the tone changed. Confidence turned into confusion. Boldness turned into backtracking. Suddenly they were the ones trying to control the narrative. They paid for the misread because restraint isn't absence of strength. It's strength under command. You weren't frozen. You were composed. And by the time they realized the difference, the damage was already done. Not to you, but to their credibility, their leverage, and the illusion that they ever had the upper hand at all. Number 7. Each defeat rewired the enemy instead of breaking you. What they didn't anticipate was that failure has a direction. They assumed every loss would weaken you, drain you, wear you down piece by piece. That's how it usually works when someone is under constant pressure. But in this case, the damage went the other way. Every failed attempt didn't scar you, it destabilized them. At first they brushed it off. One misstep can be explained. 2 can be blamed on timing. But when defeat becomes repetitive, something shifts internally. Confidence erodes quietly. Decision-making gets sloppy. Doubt creeps in, not as fear but as irritation. And irritation is dangerous because it clouds judgment. You didn't need to touch them for this to happen. Their own failures did the work. Meanwhile, you weren't internalizing the losses at all. You weren't telling yourself stories about being cursed, unlucky, or targeted because you're weak. You stayed grounded in reality. You adapted. You learned. You kept moving forward without dramatizing what was happening. That calm response is what made the contrast so stark. While you stayed intact, they started unraveling. Each time they failed, they had to explain it to themselves. Why didn't it work? What did they miss? That constant questioning rewired their thinking in unhealthy ways. They became hyper-focused on you, replaying events, overanalyzing your actions, searching for flaws that weren't there. Obsession replaced clarity. Strategy gave way to fixation. You, on the other hand, didn't carry the emotional residue of each encounter. You processed it and released it. That's why you stayed sharp. That's why you didn't harden or become reactive. You weren't collecting defeats. You were collecting insight. And insight strengthens without weighing you down. Eventually, the imbalance became obvious. They were tense, rushed, reactive. You were steady, patient, clear. The more they tried to regain control, the more obvious their instability became to others watching. Credibility slipped. Support thinned. Allies questioned them. That's the quiet truth most people miss. Repeated failure doesn't just break plans, it reshapes the person failing. And while they were being rewired by frustration and desperation, you were being refined by awareness. The outcome was never in doubt after that. One side was evolving, the other was unraveling. Number 8. The obsession became personal when you refused to fracture. What really tipped the scales wasn't your skill, your insight, or even your awareness. It was your refusal to break. They had spent so much time and energy thinking they could destabilize you, manipulate you, or force you into chaos. Every plan, every spell, every attack was meant to fracture your mind or spirit in some measurable way. But you didn't fracture. You stayed whole. And that refusal changed the game entirely. People who rely on manipulation thrive on predictable outcomes. They feed on the expectation that pressure will lead to collapse. But when someone refuses to crumble, that expectation fails, and frustration turns into obsession. At first, they thought of it as a challenge, a puzzle to solve. Then it became personal. Their tactics weren't just ineffective, they were embarrassing, and that embarrassment bred fixation. Refusing to fracture isn't about ignoring threats or pretending to be unshakable. It's about maintaining clarity in the face of chaos, understanding the difference between what belongs to you and what doesn't, and not giving them access to reactions they can exploit. Every time they escalated, hoping for a crack, you responded with the consistency they couldn't predict. That consistency alone dismantled their strategy. The personal nature of obsession is its own kind of weapon. Once they realized you weren't going to break, the attacks shifted from professional or strategic to emotional and erratic. Their plans became reactive rather than proactive. They were no longer trying to win. They were trying to justify their inability to control you. That's when they started making mistakes that amplified your position. They miscalculated timing, misread motives, and exposed weaknesses in their own network because they were too consumed with you. The more personal the obsession became, the more they revealed about themselves, while you remained steady, focused, and untouchable. In essence, refusing to fracture forced them into a position of vulnerability. Your strength wasn't loud or visible in a way they could measure, but it was undeniable. Every failed attempt, every escalating attack, Every moment of obsession became proof that they had underestimated not just your power, but your very nature. And that realization? It's what turns obsession into defeat. Number 9. Your presence exposed other demons hiding in plain sight. You didn't have to accuse anyone or call anything out for this to happen. It happened naturally. The moment you entered certain spaces, things shifted. Conversations changed tone. People started acting strange for no clear reason. Some became defensive, others over-explained. A few suddenly distanced themselves. That wasn't coincidence. That was exposure without confrontation. What made this so unsettling is that you weren't trying to reveal anything. You weren't hunting for flaws or digging for secrets. You simply showed up as yourself, grounded and aware. And that kind of presence has a way of disrupting hidden agendas. When someone is carrying manipulation, dishonesty, or ill intent, they rely on comfort and cover. Your presence removed both. You see, darkness thrives when it blends in. It needs noise, distraction, and group agreement to stay hidden. But you brought stillness. You listened more than you spoke. You noticed inconsistencies without reacting to them. That alone made people uncomfortable. When someone realizes they're being seen clearly, not judged, just seen, masks start slipping. That's why you noticed side conflicts erupting that had nothing to do with you. People turned on each other. Long-standing alliances cracked. Secrets leaked. Tensions surfaced where there used to be fake harmony. You didn't cause that. You revealed it. And revelation feels like attack to anyone who benefits from things staying buried. Some tried to project their discomfort onto you. Others quietly exited your life. A few attempted to undermine you before you could expose them, even though you weren't planning to. That's how you knew something deeper was happening. Innocent people don't panic when clarity walks into the room. The most telling part is this. Once those hidden dynamics were exposed, they couldn't be unseen. Even after you left certain spaces, the damage was done. Trust was broken. Roles were questioned. The structure cracked. And all you did was exist without compromising yourself. That's a level of power most people don't understand. You weren't fighting demons directly. You were acting as a filter. Anything false struggled to remain stable around you. Anything dishonest became loud. Anything manipulative lost its footing. In the end, it became clear why the obsession intensified. You weren't just a target. You were a liability to everything that depended on secrecy. And nothing terrifies hidden darkness more than someone who exposes it without even trying. Number 10. You triggered self-destruction protocols without lifting a finger. What actually unraveled things wasn't anything you did directly. It was what stopped working the moment you refused to play along. Systems built on manipulation depend on cooperation, even unwilling cooperation. They need reaction, fear, confusion, emotional investment. When you withdrew that fuel, everything started malfunctioning on its own. You didn't expose anyone publicly. You didn't confront every lie. You didn't try to control the outcome. You simply stopped feeding the structure. And once that happened, the pressure that was meant to crush you had nowhere to go but inward. People started contradicting themselves. Plans overlapped and clashed. Stories didn't line up anymore. What once looked coordinated began to look messy. That's because hidden systems aren't stable by default. They're held together by constant effort. Someone has to keep lying. Someone has to keep managing perceptions. Someone has to keep everyone aligned. When one person steps out of the loop, especially someone they were fixated on, the balance breaks. The energy turns cannibalistic. You noticed it in small ways at first. Sudden infighting, allies questioning each other, people scrambling to protect themselves instead of the mission. That's a clear sign of internal collapse. You weren't the threat anymore. Distrust was, and distrust spreads faster than any external attack ever could. What's ironic is that they assumed you were powerless because you weren't acting. In reality, non-participation was the most disruptive move possible. You forced them to overmanage, over-explain, over-correct. And every over-move exposes cracks. The harder they tried to regain control, the more obvious it became that control was already gone. You didn't need revenge because the structure did that on its own. You didn't need validation because the unraveling was visible. The very obsession meant to destroy you turned into the stressor that destroyed their internal order. That's how self-destruction really works. Not through dramatic collapse, but through accumulated missteps caused by pressure, paranoia, and unchecked fixation. You didn't pull the trigger. You didn't light the fuse. You simply stepped aside and let the system reveal how unstable it always was. And once a system shows it can't sustain itself without targeting you, its end is already written. Number 11. They realized too late that you cannot be spiritually tracked. At some point, the strategy shifted from attack to surveillance. They tried to follow your movements, predict your next step, anticipate your reactions. That's what people do when control slips. They try to monitor instead. But what they ran into was something they didn't understand. You don't move in straight lines, and you don't operate on predictable timing. Most systems of control depend on patterns. If someone reacts the same way every time, thinks out loud, explains their plans, or moves according to expectation, they're easy to track. You weren't like that. You didn't announce shifts before they happened. You didn't make emotional decisions that left a trail. You didn't rush. Sometimes you moved quietly. Sometimes you paused completely. Sometimes you changed direction without warning. That unpredictability wasn't chaos. It was clarity. They tried to read signs, behaviors, energy, even people around you, but nothing stayed consistent long enough to map. The version of you they thought they understood kept expiring. By the time they adjusted, you were already operating from a different level of awareness. That's when frustration turned into panic. What made this worse for them is that tracking requires access. You cut off unnecessary explanations. You stopped oversharing. You kept parts of your life private, not out of fear, but out of discernment. That silence wasn't empty. It was protected. And protected spaces can't be invaded without permission. The more they tried to lock onto you, the more obvious it became that they were chasing an image, not the real thing. They were studying shadows while you were changing internally. That's a losing game every time. Eventually, they realized something uncomfortable. You weren't hiding. You were ungraspable. You weren't avoiding detection. There was nothing to latch onto. No consistent emotional output. No predictable reactions. No dependency they could trace back to you. By the time this truth set in, they were already behind. You had outpaced their awareness, not by speed but by depth. You weren't running. You were operating from a place they couldn't access. And once someone realizes they can't track you, can't predict you, and can't interfere without exposing themselves, the obsession loses its power. Because control only works when the target can be followed. You couldn't be. And that's when the chase finally collapsed. Number 12. Your endurance wasn't learned. It was remembered. What carried you through all of this wasn't something you picked up along the way. It wasn't a coping strategy you learned from books or advice you borrowed from others. It was deeper than that. When things intensified, something in you didn't panic or scramble to adapt. It activated. Like a muscle you didn't even know you still had, your endurance came online naturally. That's because this wasn't your first time navigating pressure like this. On some level, you recognized the terrain. You knew when to conserve energy, when to stay still, when to move, and when to let things play out without interference. That kind of knowing doesn't come from training. It comes from memory. Not surface memory, but core memory. The kind that lives below fear. While others would have burned out, You settled in. You didn't dramatize the difficulty or inflate the threat. You treated it like something you'd survived before, even if you couldn't explain how. That calm wasn't denial, it was familiarity. You understood, instinctively, that storms pass and systems collapse when they're pushed too hard. What confused your opposition was how steady you stayed over time. Short bursts of strength are common. Sustained endurance is rare. You didn't spike emotionally and crash. You didn't become reckless or numb. You maintained your center. That told them something was different about you, even if they couldn't name it. Remembering endurance doesn't mean you didn't feel pain or fatigue. It means those things didn't define your decisions. You didn't let discomfort rush you into mistakes. You didn't let exhaustion rewrite who you are. You rested when needed and resumed when ready. That pacing is a form of wisdom most people never develop. The longer it went on, the clearer it became. You weren't surviving by willpower alone. You were operating from something older, quieter, and far more reliable. A part of you knew that this phase had an expiration date, and that your job wasn't to fight endlessly, but to last. In the end, that's what separated you. Not aggression, not dominance, endurance. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits, remembers, and outlasts everything that was never built to endure in the first place. Number 13. The demons feared you more than you ever feared them. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle, creeping, and unspoken. And that's exactly what you were up against. Entities, energies, or people operating with malevolent intent, assuming that intimidation alone could bend you. They expected terror, resistance, confusion, maybe even despair. What they didn't anticipate was that you were carrying a presence that even darkness instinctively recognizes as untouchable. It's easy to assume that the one under attack is at a disadvantage, but the reality was inverted. Your clarity, your awareness, your composure, these weren't just survival tools. They were mirrors reflecting everything the opposition wanted to hide about themselves. Every move they made, every spell, every plan, it met a calm that didn't flinch. That calm, that quiet certainty, is something entities that feed on chaos can't tolerate. The more aggressive they became, the more you stayed aligned. The more erratic their tactics, the steadier you were. They expected you to react with fear, desperation, or overreaction. When that never happened, their frustration grew. That frustration is the breeding ground of fear. They realized their control was not just slipping, it was irrelevant. Your fearlessness exposed them, not by attacking, not by dominating, but simply by existing without compromise. It's an energy that doesn't have to shout to be lethal. The moment someone or something realizes their usual methods won't work, they start overcomplicating, miscalculating, second-guessing themselves. That's fear in its purest form, not panic, but creeping instability that undermines confidence. And here's the truth, fear is always contagious. Once it lives in the system meant to control you, it spreads. Allies start hesitating, plans falter, intentions get questioned. You didn't create the fear, you revealed it. You were never the one under pressure. The pressure existed inside them. By the time they comprehended the imbalance, it was too late. Fear had already taken root on the other side, and your presence remained unwavering. The one they wanted to dominate was untouched, while the ones doing the dominating were quietly unraveling, haunted by a realization they couldn't fully articulate, that whatever they thought they were chasing, controlling, or harming, it was stronger than they could ever confront. Number 14. The final defeat was realizing they never had authority over you. The biggest turning point didn't happen during an attack, a setback, or a confrontation. It happened quietly, the moment the truth settled in. They were never in charge. Not of your life, not of your direction, not of your outcome. Everything they tried was based on an assumption that you were operating under their jurisdiction. You weren't. All their efforts depended on borrowed power. Power that only works when the other person believes in it, fears it, or submits to it emotionally. Once you stopped doing that, not consciously, not dramatically, but naturally, their influence evaporated. You didn't rebel, you didn't overthrow anything. You simply stopped recognizing an authority that was never legitimate to begin with. That realization changes everything. Fear loses its grip when you understand it was never backed by real control. Threats become noise, pressure becomes inconvenience, manipulation becomes obvious. You didn't become reckless or arrogant, you became clear, and clarity is devastating to systems built on illusion. They sensed the shift before they could explain it. You stopped negotiating internally. You stopped asking for permission to exist, to move, to choose peace. You didn't seek approval or protection from the very thing trying to dominate you. That's when the panic set in on their side, because authority only survives as long as it's acknowledged. The final defeat wasn't loud. There was no dramatic collapse or final showdown. It was a slow realization that nothing they did could override your alignment. They couldn't block what wasn't dependent on them. They couldn't control what didn't answer to them. They couldn't stop what wasn't coming from fear. What made this defeat permanent is that you didn't need to win. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need closure from them. You walked away internally before anything ended externally. And once you do that, there's nothing left for the other side to grab. In the end, the war didn't conclude because one side overpowered the other. It ended because the illusion of authority collapsed. And when that happens, everything built on it falls apart on its own. You didn't escape their control. You discovered it was never real. This entire journey comes down to one undeniable truth. Nothing that was sent against you worked the way it was supposed to. Not because you fought harder, but because you operated from a level they couldn't access, influence, or override. What looked like attacks were actually exposures. What felt like pressure was really a test of systems that were never built to handle someone like you. And the more they tried to force an outcome, the more obvious it became that you were never under their control. You weren't lucky, you weren't protected by chance. You were aligned. You moved with awareness instead of fear, restraint instead of impulse, clarity instead of chaos. Every scheme depended on you reacting on cue, breaking on schedule, or doubting yourself long enough for them to step in. You didn't. You stayed intact. You stayed observant. You stayed you. And that alone dismantled everything. What truly defeated them wasn't exposure or confrontation. It was irrelevance. You outgrew their tactics, outpaced their tracking, and refused their authority without ever announcing it. While they spiraled deeper into obsession, you moved forward quietly, carrying insight instead of damage. They were trying to win a war you had already exited. This is the part people miss. Real power doesn't need validation, noise, or dominance. It shows up as stability when chaos is expected. It looks like clarity when confusion is being pushed. It feels like peace in places where fear is supposed to rule. And once you embody that, nothing designed to control you can survive for long. So, if parts of this story resonated deeply, that's not coincidence. It means you've lived some version of this yourself, and understanding it is how you stop repeating it. If this message spoke to you, do yourself a favor and stay connected. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Like this video so it reaches others who need clarity right now. Drop a comment and let your voice be heard. And share this with someone who's been under pressure and doesn't yet realize how much power they actually hold. This channel isn't about hype, it's about insight. And if you're here for a reason. God bless you.